Learning to oil paint is easy. All we need is to put its fundamental in practice. Three of its elements are the handling of the brush, the aesthetics, and the technique. Handling of the brush is about the hand position, angle, and pressure of the brush on the canvas and the amount of paint on the brush. Aesthetics is about your concept and the composition of the painting. Finally, technique has to do with four fundamentals: values, edges, texture, and color. Although the concept is the first thing that the artist feels and thinks about, you must learn how to handle the brush with some skill. To understand the technique of the four fundamentals, become familiar with linear and aerial perspective, know some ideas about aesthetics and composition, and the process of combining all this in a painting. Let's start with the first element, which is the handling of the brush. The closer to the brush hairs you hold the brush, the smaller the range. When you hold the brush near its hairs, the distance between the hand and the painting is shortened, creating a tight and limiting situation where you can lose sight of the painting as a whole. In this type of situation, we worry too much about details, so every little brushstroke becomes isolated from the rest of the painting. It is preferable to hold the brush at the opposite end to the hairs, keeping a certain distance from the canvas to achieve greater looseness, freedom of movement, flexibility, and range. This way, you can see, compare, and harmonize every brushstroke with the rest of the painting. The angle of the brush should correspond to the amount of paint you want to deposit and the direction and form you want to achieve. The more your brush is held parallel to the canvas, the more paint will be deposited and the larger the area it will cover. A greater angle of the brush, that is, touching the canvas with only the tip of the brush, will apply a more specific touch and less amount of paint. You can get fine lines with a flat brush if it is applied as if it were a knife. The pressure of the hairs of the brush on the canvas should be adequate to get the texture, the direction, and the desired effect. The stronger the pressure of the brush, the thinner the layer of paint. But little paint can be deposited on the canvas even with a brush loaded with lots of paint. Often it takes a very delicate touch to deposit paint on a painting without greatly altering the still wet paint underneath. The amount of paint on the brush has to be appropriate for the texture and the direction you want. Some students like using thin paint, others are more daring and apply a thicker layer. Usually, it's better to apply dark colors with thin paint and light colors with thicker paint. This takes advantage of the higher profile or texture of thick paint, which captures and reflects more light than dark thin paint. This increases the brightness on the light values. To prevent thick paint from cracking when drying, it is important to follow the process of fat over lean. That is, thick paint with more oil over thin paint with less oil. Thus, the thin paint underneath dries first and does not put pressure on the thick paint once it is dry. You must select the brush size according to the size of the brush stroke you want in order to achieve simplicity and economy of brush strokes. These are key in aesthetics. Usually, you should use a larger brush to cover a large area and a smaller brush to work in a smaller area. Try to avoid using small brushes repeatedly to resolve small details. Working exclusively with small brushes enslaves you to details, and this tight work will limit your expression. With practice, you can do little details with a medium or large brush by decreasing the pressure of the brush on the canvas and changing its angle from the flat to the side of the brush. Don't just use the brush, you can use any object, instrument, or combination. You can use the opposite end of the brush to make certain effects. You can also use a painting knife, plastic knife, or fork. Be curious and inventive. Remember that in art there are no absolute rules. There are only good and not so good solutions. When looking for solutions to particular problems related to the amount of paint and certain forms, large and small, you will get the necessary skill with the brush. The more you practice, the faster you will learn how to handle the brush or any other tool you apply the paint with. Try creating your own repertoire of techniques. Visit museums and art galleries to see how some artists of the past and present solve the technical problems which you face. Be curious. Notice the direction of the brushstroke, the texture created, and the amount of paint the brush brought to the canvas. This will give you a reference to assess your own work. Take advantage of the information the great masters of painting have left us. When looking at the work of another artist, it is extremely important to always choose techniques that excite your own taste and emotion. In one word, your concept.